I recently spent an afternoon with a business owner who runs a small, specialized construction firm. He's the type who, genuinely buys into the vision solar panels on his warehouse, electric vans for his crew, the whole 9 yards.
Right, an early adopter.
Totally. He was actually bragging to me about a new shipment of low-carbon aluminum he'd sourced from abroad. He saw it as a victory, a way to stay ahead of the curve while doing his part for the planet. To him, the green transition wasn't a burden, it was a moral badge of honor.
Mm-hmm.
But then he showed me the paperwork that had landed on his desk a few days prior. And his face, which had been bright with that green pioneer glow, it just went tight.
Here it comes.
He wasn't looking at a carbon footprint report. He was looking at what he called a bureaucratic ransom note. It was this stack of compliance forms demanding the intimate production details of a factory halfway across the world, data he couldn't possibly get for a tax he couldn't possibly afford.
The reality check.
The most telling part was his reaction when I mentioned that as of 2026, these same rules would be tightened into a full-scale enforcement regime, covering everything from the cement he pours to the very electricity in the grid.
Oh.
That calm, eco-conscious demeanor just vanished instantly. He didn't talk about the climate anymore. He started pacing, calling the regulators vultures, and muttering that they were taxing him back into the 19th century. It was a jarring shift from a true believer in the green future to a man realizing he was actually being fitted for an industrial noose. That moment of realization where the idealistic rhetoric of saving the world hits the cold wall of global trade reality is exactly where we stand today. What is being framed as a planetary rescue mission is looking less like environmental policy and more like the formal funeral of free trade. We are witnessing the rise of a green tax wall, and it's designed to do one thing: manage the deindustrialization of the West. Okay, so let's unpack this. That moment of realization where idealism slams into that cold wall of bureaucratic reality, that's exactly where we are today.
It really is.
We're doing a deep dive into what's being framed as this planetary rescue mission, but is looking more like the formal funeral of free trade, the rise of this green tax wall, specifically the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, and its whole regulatory suite.
Right.
So our mission today is to really understand this unprecedented use of trade policy, how it affects everyone from local businesses to sovereign nations, and what the real price of this green transition might be.
And that framing the green tax wall, it's intensely relevant because CBAM is not just a passive fee or another regulatory hurdle. It's fundamentally altering the global economic architecture at its deepest level.
Okay, so define it for us. What is CBAM at its core?
When we define CBAM, we're talking about a system where importers into the European Union, they have to purchase emission certificates. These certificates are required to account for the total carbon that's embedded in the products they import.
So everything from the manufacturing process itself to the energy used to make it.
Exactly. The whole life cycle.
So the core aim is essentially to make sure that foreign producers are paying a carbon price that's equivalent to what EU domestic producers already pay under their own system, the emissions trading system, or ETS. It's meant to be a simple equalization tax.
That's the idea. It's meant to close the cost gap. The ETS is the EU's existing mechanism for pricing carbon for its own industry and power sector. We can call that ETS1. CBAM is just the external mirror of that price.
So it's about eliminating the advantage that foreign competitors would have if they're operating in places without a carbon price.
That's it. You got it.
And the timeline here is critical. We're in a transitional phase right now, but the real hammer drops soon.
Absolutely. The transition from just reporting to full-scale financial enforcement begins in January 2026. That's when the financial penalties actually start applying, and importers have to purchase the certificates.
And starts with a few key sectors.
It starts with 6 foundational, really carbon-intensive industries: steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen.
The literal backbone of modern infrastructure and heavy manufacturing.
Which is why this mechanism has such vast radiating impacts across the globe.
Right. So critics are calling it a bureaucrat's noose and a unilateral power grab disguised as climate policy. If the goal is just to level the playing field, where does all this outrage come from? What makes it feel like such an overreach?
Well, the outrage really stems from its vast extraterritorial reach and the compliance burden it puts on foreign firms. The argument is that this isn't a traditional tariff, which governments use to raise revenue or protect an industry's border.
Right.
Instead, critics see it as positioning the European Commission as the global arbiter of carbon costs.
meaning Brussels is basically dictating production processes and energy sourcing for manufacturers anywhere in the world.
Dictating, not suggesting. That's the key. They're setting complex accounting standards for factories on the other side of the planet.
And this is where that cost of compliance comes in, which is more than just the price of a certificate. You hear this idea that bureaucracy is actively replacing innovation. How does that actually play out on the factory floor?
It plays out as a systematic diversion of capital away from R&D and into, well, administrative compliance.
Okay.
To make this tangible, let's look at the experience of this one owner, Altan, who runs a specialty steel plant in Istanbul. His family business relied on precision and agility to supply niche components to the highly regulated European auto industry.
So his whole business model was built on manufacturing excellence.
Exactly. And now CBAM creates this labyrinth of new reporting obligations. His core business is melting and shaping steel. But to comply, he's now required to account for every milligram of carbon tied not just to his furnace, but also to his entire electricity provider's grid mix.
Wow.
And even the emissions embedded in his raw material suppliers' processes. And that can go 2 or 3 layers deep into the supply chain. He described the paperwork as a bureaucratic ransom note.
So he has to get these intimate production details from companies who might not even want to share them just to satisfy a regulator thousands of miles away.
The administrative requirement is monstrous. The critical cost isn't even the tax itself, it's the cost of verification. He has to hire these expensive, specialized consultants and administrative staff just to navigate the bureaucracy.
And that money has to come from somewhere.
It wiped out his entire research and development budget for years. His capacity to innovate, to develop new, lower carbon steel alloys or more energy efficient processes, it's just gone.
So his firm is hiring tax accountants and compliance officers for a foreign government instead of hiring engineers to actually solve the climate problem. That seems to fundamentally shift the whole paradigm of competition.
It does. The creative spirit of manufacturing gets choked by administrative necessity. And the perverse incentive here is that the winners in this new regime, they're not necessarily the companies with the best, most carbon-efficient products.
Who are the winners then?
The winners are the companies, usually the large multinational corporations, with the biggest administrative teams and the deepest pockets for consultants. Altan's story basically makes the argument that this mechanism puts a Brussels tax collector inside every foreign factory.
That makes the cost incredibly tangible. But we have to step back and look at the core objective here, carbon leakage. Does this punitive mechanism actually achieve its stated climate goal? What's the data say?
Right, the core climate rationale, again, is preventing carbon leakage. This is the whole phenomenon where strict carbon prices in the EU cause industry to just shift production to countries with, laxer environmental standards.
Which would mean no net global reduction in emissions while Europe deindustrializes.
Exactly. CBAM is designed explicitly to stop that leakage from happening.
And the quantitative modeling confirms that it works.
Yes. The models confirm that CBAM measurably increases the effectiveness of the whole EU climate policy mix. If you look at the impact of European carbon taxes alone, the ETS, without any border adjustment, the modeling shows it achieves a global emissions reduction of about 17.1 megatons of CO2.
Which is significant on its own.
It is. But when you add CBAM to that policy mix, the total global emissions reduction rises to 18.45 megatons.
So it's working. It's preventing the leakage that would otherwise occur.
It reinforces the EU's domestic efforts by externalizing the cost to any non-compliant trade partners.
You also mentioned that this makes the transition more economically efficient for the world. We need to unpack that. What is marginal abatement cost and how does CBAM lower it?
Marginal abatement cost is essentially the economic cost that the global system incurs to remove or prevent 1 additional ton of CO2 from being emitted. It's the metric for policy efficiency. Without a CBAM, the modeling shows that this cost is high, at around $144 per ton of CO2. This is because firms are just choosing to abate carbon where the regulation is stiffest, often at great expense, while at the same time fleeing to cheaper, unregulated markets.
So the leakage undermines the efficiency.
Precisely. By adding CBAM, that cost falls to $131 per ton of CO2.
That's a $13 saving per ton.
It might sound small, but when you scale it across the massive volume of global industrial production, it represents a huge global efficiency gain. By forcing a global price signal, CBAM ensures that carbon reduction efforts are allocated to the most cost-effective places instead of just pushing emissions around the map.
So despite the administrative complexity and the pain it imposes on firms like Alton's, the mechanism delivers a measurable climate benefit.
It delivers a verifiable benefit, and it shields European climate efforts from being negated by those trade shifts.
It's the ultimate trade-off, isn't it? Maximum climate efficiency achieved through maximum bureaucratic friction.
It forces the world to internalize the carbon cost of goods, which is what economists have been arguing is the necessary step for broad, efficient decarbonization for decades.
Okay, let's pivot and turn our attention inward to Europe itself. Because this green tax wall isn't just external. There's a massive, politically toxic internal battle brewing over the social acceptability of these policies. The EU is aiming for climate neutrality by 2050, but the necessary pace is turning what was supposed to be a smooth transition into an abrupt one, and that's inevitably raising costs for ordinary citizens.
And this is the core social tension, the need to make this transition just. Decades of, frankly, policy procrastination mean that a smooth, gradual shift is just not on the table anymore.
So they have to compress the timeline.
They're compressing the timeline for decarbonization, which necessitates an abrupt transition that is guaranteed to exacerbate existing social challenges, especially energy poverty. Any successful green transition has to address these distributional effects first, or it risks catastrophic political backlash.
And the biggest flashpoint for that political instability is this high-risk proposal called Emissions Trading System 2, or ETS 2. We need a detailed explanation of what this is and why it's so risky.
Right. ETS 2 is the European Commission's proposal to drastically expand carbon pricing. Unlike the existing system, ETS 1, which covers large industrial emitters and power plants, ETS 2 targets emissions from two sectors that directly affect every single citizen, buildings and road transport.
So we're talking about pricing the emissions from, 200 million European families' home heating systems and their personal cars. This hits the household budget directly.
Precisely. The regulatory burden will fall on the fossil fuel suppliers, the companies selling natural gas for your furnace or gasoline for your car, but they will inevitably pass those carbon costs directly on to consumers.
Which creates massive price uncertainty.
Severe price uncertainty. The existing ETS1 has seen prices fluctuate wildly from €5 to €60 per ton. ETS2, however, involves even greater costs because the abatement challenge in buildings and transport is just structurally harder than in a big power plant.
And the volatility forecasts are alarming. We're not talking about small, predictable cost increases.
No, we're talking about a volatile market mechanism hitting core necessities. The proposed design for ETS2 is highly aggressive. Even if they start at a hypothetical price of €40 per ton of CO2 in 2026, the design includes a really high annual linear reduction factor of 5.43%.
What does that mean, the linear reduction factor?
It means it mandates a steep, predictable reduction in the total number of allowances available each year. It guarantees scarcity.
So the price isn't just rising because of demand, but because the supply of permits is being bureaucratically forced downward, aggressively.
Exactly. That structural scarcity, coupled with a high reliance on fossil fuels in these sectors, could allow prices to just spiral. Forecasts suggest it could allow prices to hit €80 per ton the following year and potentially spike up to €160 per ton of CO2 the year after that.
A price shock of that magnitude, hitting people's ability to heat their homes or get to work, that's a formula for major social unrest.
And a populist political explosion. It's the textbook definition of a regressive tax, and it disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable.
Who gets hit the hardest?
Low-income households are highly vulnerable because they spend a disproportionately large share of their income on energy. The data shows that the 10% lowest income families in the EU already spend nearly 10% of their total income just on household energy.
Before you even factor in transport.
For transport. So when you introduce a major carbon price hike, you push a lot of families into energy poverty.
And this vulnerability isn't uniform across Europe, is it? There are huge regional disparities.
That's crucial. The source material highlights Poland as a stark example. For the 20% least affluent households in Poland, where heating relies heavily on high carbon coal, a CO2 price of $100 per ton could translate into a massive 52% increase in their annual spending on heating.
52%, that's just unsustainable.
And it's double the average EU increase.
Yeah.
So the impact is this deadly mix of wealth disparity, existing infrastructure, and geography.
A trifecta of vulnerability, as you put it.
It is. I mean, think about it. An urban low-income family in modern, well-insulated social housing with great public transport is relatively insulated.
Right.
Now, contrast that with a rural, middle-income family in an older, energy-inefficient house who relies solely on fossil fuels for heat and a car for transport. The latter is far more vulnerable.
And they often lack the capital to invest in green alternatives, like a heat pump or better insulation.
Exactly. In the absence of immediate successful counterbalancing measures, ETS2 is widely seen as socially and politically unsustainable.
Which brings us to the supposed remedy, the Social Climate Fund, or SCF. Based on the analysis, is this fund robust enough to mitigate such an enormous risk?
The criticism suggests the Social Climate Fund, as it's currently proposed, is fundamentally inadequate, both in its scale and in its timing.
What's it supposed to do?
It's intended to serve two masters: mitigate the immediate social impacts like income support and fund long-term structural green investments like energy renovation or better public transit.
But the proposal only earmarks 25% of the projected ETS2 revenues for it.
Only 25%. And based on a hypothetical average carbon price, that's estimated to be around $10 billion per year.
$10 billion sounds like a lot of money.
It sounds substantial, but the fund has to cover both immediate financial compensation and massive long-term structural investments at the same time. The analysis shows it's just too small for both roles.
And there's a fatal timing flaw.
A fatal timing flaw. Structural green investments, deep energy renovation, modernizing public transport. These things take several years, sometimes a decade, to actually show a positive effect on energy bills.
And the fund starts when?
The current proposal suggests the SCF would start operations in 2025, only 1 year before ETS2 implementation begins in 2026. That is simply too late for the structural changes to materialize before the punishing price spikes hit.
So they're accelerating the tax, but the safety net funding is delayed. It's like installing the fire alarm after the fire has already started.
There's an additional crippling legal problem, too.
Oh, great.
The Commission proposed funding the SCF using a new EU-owned resource. Legally, adopting that requires unanimity among the Council and ratification by all national parliaments.
And achieving unanimity on funding mechanisms is historically difficult.
Very difficult. So if they can't get that consensus, the SCF remains an empty shell, but the ETS2 tax increase rolls out anyway.
So what's the alternative plan? How do you ensure a just transition if this is the setup?
Well, the strong argument is to abandon ETS2 entirely because of the extreme political risk. It's just too dangerous.
Okay, so if you abandon ETS2, what happens to the Social Climate Fund?
The consensus alternative is that the Social Climate Fund should still be established, but it should be financed using 15% of revenues from the existing ETS1, the industrial and power sector system.
How much would that generate?
Around $6 billion a year at current carbon prices.
And why is that method superior?
First, ETS1 revenues are already available, and the legal basis for using them avoids that political quagmire of the unanimity rule. Second, this smaller, more reliably funded SCF would focus solely on targeted green investments for vulnerable families.
So it's not trying to do two things at once.
Right. It moves away from the impossible balancing act of funding both immediate compensation and long-term investment. It's a pragmatic, lower-risk approach that avoids the severe social and political instability of the ETS2 rollout.
That makes sense. Moving from a direct, painful, regressive tax on consumers to a targeted, long-term investment fund. It seems like the only politically sustainable path for Europe internally. But the external policy, CBAM, is proving far less acceptable to Europe's major trade partners.
And that leads us directly into this high-stakes clash of sovereignty.
The external policy is built on the same ambitious unilateral foundation. The core issue of extraterritorial reach is driving an expansion of what's been dubbed the Brussels effect. Because of the sheer size and regulatory strictness of the EU market, European requirements are essentially adopted by foreign firms globally just to minimize their compliance burdens.
Right. It turns the EU into a de facto global standard setter in everything from climate policy to corporate governance.
So if a company in South Korea or Brazil wants to be part of any significant global supply chain, they often have to abide by European rules, even if they don't sell directly into the EU themselves.
That's the Brussels effect in full force. The EU sees this as setting standards for the planet, forcing global climate action. But critics, especially in Washington and increasingly in Asia, they view this as blatant green protectionism.
An intrusion on the sovereign right of other nations to regulate their own economy.
Exactly.
And this is why the CBAM mechanism is legally vulnerable, specifically under World Trade Organization rules. How could it be challenged?
CBAM is legally vulnerable to challenge based on principles of non-discrimination. The EU will inevitably have to rely on the general exceptions for health and environmental measures under GATT Article XX.
But it runs into core inconsistencies with a much more fundamental principle, the national treatment rule. What is that, and how does CBAM violate it?
The national treatment rule demands that imported products be given no less favorable treatment than similar domestic products. The inconsistency here stems directly from the ongoing use of free emissions allowances for domestic EU producers under ETS 1.
They're phasing them out, but they still exist for now.
Right. But imported products must purchase full CBAM certificates immediately.
So European steel manufacturers get a certain amount of carbon permits for free, which lowers their production cost. But the imported steel is taxed at the full rate. That sounds like a textbook case of unequal competitive opportunity.
It is precisely the argument. This design is seen as providing double protection for European products. First, they get free allowances, and second, the imported goods pay a full carbon price. It denies imported goods an equality of competitive opportunities.
If the EU wants CBAM to withstand a WTO challenge, it has to be even-handed. It can't be a disguised restriction on international trade. Those free allowances seem like a fatal legal mistake.
That is the consensus among leading trade legal experts. Keeping them is viewed as an indefensible advantage. To survive scrutiny, the EU would either have to fully offset the value of the free allowances or, more likely, eliminate them entirely for domestic production.
Which would be extremely painful for their own industry.
Very.
This tension is particularly acute with the United States, which lacks an equivalent federal carbon tax. What's the American perspective on this invisible wall?
The American view is that this is a direct assault on U.S. economic sovereignty driven by European green protectionism, and it could trigger a transatlantic trade war.
An actual trade war.
To illustrate this, let's look at the perspective of Sarah, a plant manager at a U.S. fertilizer plant on the Gulf Coast. Fertilizer production is highly energy intensive, and it often relies on natural gas as a feedstock, which is cheap in the U.S. compared to Europe.
A huge competitive advantage.
Exactly. Her plant exports to Europe, and suddenly her product gets hit with this massive regulatory levy because the U.S. doesn't have an equivalent federal carbon tax. She describes CBAM as an invisible wall and sees it as unelected bureaucrats in Brussels effectively taxing American energy and dictating factory operations in the U.S.
It sounds like the U.S. energy sector feels they're being treated as a non-compliant economic rival, not a key ally.
That's the sentiment. Analysts are calling this a high-stakes game of geopolitical chicken. The U.S. feels it's being penalized for using its own abundant natural resources, specifically natural gas, and for refusing to adopt a European-style climate regulatory framework.
And this regulatory overreach doesn't stop with carbon pricing. The sources also highlight something called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDD, as an even broader issue.
The CSDD is a sweeping piece of EU legislation that mandates companies conduct comprehensive due diligence on their entire value chain to identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts on human rights and the environment.
So this is forcing American firms to internalize European stakeholder governance models.
That is the core conflict. U.S. corporate law traditionally centers on the fiduciary duty of management being exclusively to shareholders. CSDD directly purports to override that. It forces American firms, just by having a minor connection to a European supply chain, to consider non-shareholder interests.
Which creates a direct legal and philosophical challenge to American government.
Absolutely. And it empowers EU member states to bring enforcement actions and levy significant financial penalties against an American firm, regardless of whether that firm has a major European operational footprint. Some U.S. legal observers see this as a risk of turning cash-rich U.S. companies into the cash cows of indebted European governments.
If Brussels dictates due diligence for a company in Alabama, that's an extreme imposition of foreign law. How is the U.S. responding?
The U.S. response is sharp and escalating. We're seeing legislative pushback, like the proposed Protect USA Act of 2025. This act aims to prohibit American companies from complying with CSDD or similar extraterritorial laws without an explicit presidential waiver.
That sets up a cycle of retaliation.
It does. The executive branch has various levers it could pull. They could revoke exemptions for European firms from filing under U.S. accounting standards, for example. The goal is to signal that Europe's solution to its own lagging growth can't be to saddle American businesses with regulatory overreach.
That confrontation is extremely risky. It seems the more constructive path would be to find some agreement on regulatory equivalency.
That is the diplomatic necessity. The tension lies in balancing climate ambition with critical trade relationships. Unilateral measures like CBAM are highly contested and lead to market fragmentation. A better approach would involve respecting trade norms, providing clarity on equivalency, and moving towards flexible, negotiated clean trade and investment partnerships.
Okay, before we delve into the big philosophical critique of this whole policy structure, let's step back and anchor ourselves in the objective data. The trade models tell a very clear story about who wins and who loses from CBAM.
They absolutely do. The quantitative models confirm that CBAM is highly effective in improving domestic European competitiveness, which, let's be honest, was a central motivation alongside the climate goals.
Can we quantify that competitive lift?
Focusing on aluminum and steel, the modeling shows that CBAM reduces European producer surplus losses by $1 billion compared to a scenario with just a carbon tax and no CBAM.
And producer surplus is basically the profit realized by domestic European producers.
Yes. CBAM achieves this because the import tax drives up the price of goods within the EU market. This allows domestic producers to sell their own products at that higher price, which translates directly into higher profits.
What about the global incidence? Does this border tax disproportionately harm lower-income countries?
This is a complex finding. The model found that the effects on consumers and producers outside the EU are generally income neutral. Emissions intensity in lower-income countries isn't systematically higher than in richer countries, so the tax impact isn't inherently regressive across the developing world.
So who bears the burden?
The burden is borne by high-emission foreign producers everywhere. They face a double burden: the tax on their exports to the EU, plus the lower prices they receive in non-EU markets because of trade reallocation.
And globally, who experiences the biggest negative shock to overall economic well-being or social welfare?
The modeling for iron and steel is revealing. While most nations experience some negative GDP effects, the EU27 benefits the most in terms of social welfare. This is followed by the US, Japan, and, surprisingly, Russia.
And who is hit hardest?
China experiences the most pronounced social welfare declines, estimated to be the largest negative impact, followed closely by India.
But on the emissions front, we saw that CBAM successfully reduces leakage globally. Does the model break that down by country?
It does. The modeling confirms a positive impact. CBAM successfully reduces the CO2 emissions of all countries except the EU and Japan.
Wait, why did the EU and Japan's emissions actually rise slightly in the model?
It's a modeling nuance. CBAM raises prices in those markets, which incentivizes slightly more carbon price production domestically. But the critical point is that the overall effect is a net global reduction, as the leakage that would have occurred is sharply reduced.
The reduction is just being achieved elsewhere.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the strategic leverage CBAM gives the EU. This incentive for other nations to adopt their own carbon pricing, it's the financial carrot with the trade stick.
This is arguably the most strategic and, frankly, brilliant aspect of CBAM's design. It creates a powerful financial incentive for other nations to adopt their own domestic carbon pricing. Think of it purely in terms of revenue capture. An exporter to the EU pays the exact same total carbon tax, let's call it $6, regardless of where that revenue goes.
If they don't have a tax, Brussels captures the $6 through the CBAM certificate. If they do implement a domestic tax, their own government captures that revenue.
Precisely. The design creates a policy ultimatum. If you have to pay a carbon price to sell into the massive European market, wouldn't you rather that revenue stay home to fund your own transition?
It's a massive fiscal incentive. So how is a major industrial economy like China responding to this?
Well, China is responding very strategically and efficiently. While they haven't adopted a border adjustment mechanism themselves, the Chinese government is responding by expanding its own existing tradable performance standard, its domestic carbon control system, to cover the exact same CBAM-targeted sectors: aluminum, cement, and steel.
So they're aligning their domestic regulation. What financial benefit does that give them?
The modeling shows that by joining this CBAM coalition, so to speak, China reduces its domestic welfare losses associated with carbon regulation by over $1.5 billion.
So while there's an initial shock, their strategic governmental response actually turns this into a powerful nudge, driving global policy alignment and efficiency gains for them.
Over the long run, that is the intended result. CBAM policies are designed to encourage global green investment. The models show that if the carbon tax prompts just a modest 10% reduction in the emissions intensity of new production capacity globally.
Just 10%.
The marginal abatement cost of regulation falls by nearly 30% for the entire European CBAM coalition.
That's a staggering efficiency gain from a modest nudge in investment. It confirms the mechanism works in forcing capital toward lower carbon tech.
The future green transition demands exactly this kind of targeted green investment at a global scale if climate targets are to be met efficiently. It's a mechanism that forces investment over retreat.
The numbers confirm that the mechanism is effective, both in reducing leakage and in providing this massive incentive for global alignment. But now we have to step back and ask the philosophical question. Is this truly just about climate efficiency, or is it about something else entirely?
And that leads directly to the critique of regulated decline. The argument, often from economic conservators and industrial leaders, is that the EU is using its regulatory power to manage its retreat from the high-growth, high-energy global economy.
And CBAM is only one of the tools being deployed. Let's look at the other non-price measures.
The EU is using a vast array of them. This includes the regulation on deforestation-free products, or EUDR, which prohibits the import of things like coffee, cattle, and palm oil if they were produced on land subjected to deforestation after December 2020. It forces traceability deep into global agriculture.
And there's also the methane regulation.
Exactly. The methane regulation requires oil and gas importers to demonstrate that their supply chains meet EU-equivalent monitoring standards for methane leakage.
And maritime shipping is next on the list.
It's already included in the ETS. Operators of large cargo ships traveling between an EU and a foreign port are currently liable for 50% of the emissions. This sets the foundation for CBAM to potentially cover that remaining 50% in the future.
All of this creates this encompassing regulatory web. But why does that lead critics to argue Europe has entered a period of civilizational fatigue and embraced a future of regulated decline?
The core of the critique is that Europe, facing fierce global competition from Asia and the US, has seemingly abandoned the pursuit of growth and is substituting innovation and dynamism with administrative control.
So in this view, CBAM isn't a climate solution. It's a punitive barrier designed to stop industry from fleeing the EU's structurally high energy costs.
High energy costs that are, in part, the result of the EU's own policy choices. The argument is that the Green Deal policies, especially the rapid exit from nuclear power, have resulted in Europe having some of the world's highest industrial energy prices.
If you can't fix the root cause of your lack of competitiveness, you build a wall to punish everyone else for not having the same high costs.
That's the argument. And the story of the retired German craftsman, Klaus, perfectly illustrates this perspective of regulated poverty.
Tell us about him.
Klaus was a master tool and die maker who retired early after his chemical plant in Ludwigshafen faced yet another round of layoffs and downsizing, primarily due to soaring energy prices. He described the Green Deal not as a triumph of technology, but as a blueprint for regulated poverty.
He watched his town and industry crumble, believing their high costs made them permanently uncompetitive.
He specifically recalled the decision to shutter stable nuclear plants, which left Germany heavily reliant on increasingly expensive and volatile gas supplies. From his perspective, the policy framework isn't about fostering the next generation of industrial innovation, it's about administering managed decline.
He sees the industry that built the middle class fleeing to places where energy is still seen as an affordable tool for growth, while Europe installs barriers to slow the exodus.
That is the essential critique, that the ultimate price of this green transition is the erosion of economic liberty and long-term prosperity. It signals a retreat from dynamism into a static, bureaucratically controlled order where compliance is prioritized over growth.
That is a fundamental tension that the EU must contend with. If the green tax wall fragments global markets and alienates major trading partners like the US and China, the entire climate project could fail under diplomatic pressure.
Diplomatic stability is the final necessity. Unilateral actions risk fragmenting markets and damaging crucial relationships, precisely when global cooperation is needed most.
So what's the consensus for a diplomatic off-ramp? A way to achieve the goals without the massive geopolitical friction?
The consensus involves moving away from these highly contested unilateral measures. The constructive path involves respecting traditional trade norms, providing absolute clarity on regulatory equivalency, which is the key ask from American and Asian firms, and pursuing flexible, clean trade and investment partnerships.
So, negotiated bilateral or multilateral agreements designed to achieve the same climate goals, but through collaboration and mutual recognition, not imposition.
Exactly. This deep dive has shown that CBAM is far more than a simple carbon tax. It is a powerful lever fundamentally changing the rules of global manufacturing, corporate governance, and trade accountability, forcing every nation to adjust to a new reality shaped by Europe's pressures.
The debate is no longer about whether climate policy is necessary,
But how its costs are distributed, who controls the mechanisms of enforcement, and whether the pursuit of a greener future will come at the ultimate expense of economic liberty and international diplomatic stability.
This powerful combination of a price signal, regulatory enforcement, and global economic alignment through CBAM fundamentally redefines the relationship between trade and climate policy.
We are witnessing the first large-scale experiment in weaponizing trade policy for ecological ends, and every government and manufacturer is now scrambling to understand how to survive the new rules, hoping to find efficiency gains before they succumb to the weight of compliance.
It seems like the true test of CBAM won't be whether it reduces carbon, but whether the diplomatic and economic structures of global trade can bend without breaking under this unprecedented regulatory weight. That's the high-stakes outcome we'll all be watching for.